Miss Marple and the bottle of perfume that killed with one spray. The garden at Thornfield Manor shimmered in the June sunshine, its borders meticulously trimmed into shapes only decades of obsessive care could achieve. Climbing roses intertwined with purple clematis, and flower beds formed geometric patterns that would have graced any gardening catalogue. It was precisely the kind of afternoon the ladies of St. Mary Mead would remember for years, though certainly not for the reasons they had anticipated when they accepted their invitations. The third annual Thornfield Manor Garden Day celebration had been carefully planned by its hostess, Mrs. Constance Weatherly, a 62-year-old widow whose fortune came from her late husband's import business. She regarded these gatherings as a social obligation of her station, though she didn't much care for them. She liked the people who attended even less, despite having invested considerable effort in presenting the illusion of radiant hospitality. Miss Jane Marple, aged 85, was descending slowly along the garden path, her mahogany walking stick tapping softly on the limestone flagstones. She wore a cotton dress patterned in muted shades of cream and grey, with a wide-brimmed felt hat that had seen better days, but was still perfectly respectable. Beside her walked her dear friend Mrs. Pemberton, a woman of similar age whose conversation invariably gravitated to her various ailments, all of which she described with a precision that suggested both pride and genuine suffering. "My back pain has been excruciating this week," Mrs. Pemberton remarked, as they paused beside a bed of Asiatic lilies. "Dr. Hartley suggests it's the change in barometric pressure, but I think it's simply God's punishment for eating biscuits after 6 in the evening." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though her blue-grey eyes were entirely focused on the various groups of people scattered around the garden. It was a lifelong habit, this quiet observation of human nature, honed over decades of life at St. Mary Mead, where the most intense dramas unfolded beneath the surface of perfect civility. She saw things, not because she particularly sought to see them, but because after so many years, she simply could not help noticing the patterns of human behavior, the same patterns that repeated themselves in different contexts with the monotony of a motif in a tapestry. For example, she noticed that young Miss Violet Ashford, the recent fiancée of the local solicitor, Jeremy Weatherly, the hostess's cousin, was keeping a deliberate distance from her fiancé while conversing with particular animation with the bank manager, a gentleman named Martin Raleigh. The way she touched her arm when she laughed, the way her eyes lit up in a way they didn't when she looked at Mr. Weatherly, were small details that most people would never have noticed. But Miss Marple noticed them, just as she noticed Mr. Weatherly's furrowed brow, as he stood by a stone fountain, pretending to be deeply interested in his champagne glass. "Isn't it lovely?" Mrs. Pemberton asked, apparently referring to the arrangement of white peonies. "Although I think the plant lice have begun to affect some of the buds. My gardener, that awful man, simply doesn't have the touch for delicate plants." Yes," Miss Marple replied distractedly, as she watched the hostess, Mrs. Weatherly, who was actually engaged in conversation with her sister, Mrs. Edith Carmichael. These two women, clearly sisters by the similarity of their features, the prominent noses, the small piercing eyes, appeared to be at odds over something of considerable importance. Their voices, though kept in tones appropriate for a social gathering, had that strained quality which Miss Marple had learned to recognize as indicative of a long-standing dispute. "The situation is completely untenable, Constance," Mrs. Carmichael was saying, just loud enough for someone with Miss Marple's ears to hear if that person were paying careful attention, which of course they were. I cannot go on like this. I simply cannot. So what exactly are you suggesting? Mrs. Weatherly would reply, her voice as sharp as glass. That I become a beggar. That I return to the insecure years I've lived through after all I've worked for. Miss Marple shifted her attention to a pot of begonias, as if sincerely admiring their mottled leaves while her mind processed this brief but revealing interaction. Financial troubles? A dispute over money? Money, in her experience, was invariably more interesting than it first appeared. It was also at this time that Miss Marple noticed Dr. Lawrence Whitmore, the local physician, who was keeping himself apart from the general crowd, smoking a cigarette with the expression of someone who found all social gatherings deeply offensive. He was a man of about 55, with greying hair, and a face that had once been handsome before bitterness had etched it into permanent wrinkles. Something in his body language, the way he constantly scanned the crowd with his eyes as if searching for something, suggested that he was not there for pleasure. Miss Marple, a young voice interrupted his remarks. What a joy to see you! It was Victoria Martin, Mrs. Weatherly's niece, a young woman of 23 with those large, eager eyes that suggested an intelligence beyond her station, and a manner of speaking that indicated education at the finest schools. She wore a pale pink dress that had been tailored, though not recently made, and her dark hair was styled in a way that required considerable attention. "My dear Victoria," replied Miss Marple, offering her cheek for a kiss. "How is your mother?" "Quite well, thank you," replied Victoria, though her expression suggested this was perhaps a pious exaggeration. "The heat has affected her, though. She's inside, resting in the music room. My aunt was very considerate to allow her to retire." Miss Marple made a mental note of this detail. Mrs. Carmichael relaxing in the house, while she and her sister had been having what seemed to be a rather serious argument just minutes before. Or had she seen things incorrectly? No, she was quite sure she had seen Mrs. Carmichael in the garden. "You look pale, my dear," observed Miss Marple, her sharp eyes examining the young woman's face. "Is everything all right?" Victoria hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Miss Marple saw something interesting. Fear. Not the ordinary fear of a young woman at a social gathering, but something deeper, something that seemed to have settled in the lines around her eyes, like a tenant who wouldn't leave. "Okay," Victoria finally said. "It's just, well, things have been a bit tense lately. My aunt has a lot on her mind, I suppose." Before Miss Marple could elaborate on this interesting observation, a sharp sound pierced the garden. It wasn't exactly a shout, but rather a sound of sudden surprise, followed by an awkward silence. Miss Marple and Victoria turned around to see their hostess, Mrs. Constance Weatherly, standing in the middle of the garden, her teacup discarded on the ground, her hands outstretched as if she had been making a gesture beyond her control. Her face had taken on a yellowish-grey hue, and her eyes were wide with an expression of utter shock. Then, with a slowness that seemed to last an eternity, Mrs. Weatherly collapsed upon herself like a structure that had lost its support, falling haphazardly into the white peonies she had so carefully cultivated. What followed was contained chaos, the kind that only occurs when educated middle-class English people are confronted with the unexpected. Screams were muffled. Movements were restrained by the social need not to make a scene, and most people simply froze in incongruous confusion. It was Dr. Whitmore who crossed the space first, his medical training overcoming his generally grumpy disposition. He knelt beside the slumped figure, his fingers searching for a pulse in its throat, his eyes quickly scanning its face with the practiced competence of someone who had seen many medical emergencies in his career. "Someone call the police," he said, his voice sharp and authoritative, "and bring a blanket, quickly." Miss Marple didn't move immediately. While others rushed to carry out the doctor's orders, she simply remained where she was, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Weatherly's form. And that was how she saw something others didn't see. Something so small, so insignificant, that it would have meant nothing to most people. Less than 3 meters from Mrs. Weatherly's right hand, almost hidden in the rim of a rose pot, lay a small glass bottle, deep sapphire blue. It looked like a perfume bottle, the kind that elegant women carried in their handbags for touch-ups during the day. The bottle was in the position of having been recently discarded, as if someone had hastily thrown it away after use. Miss Marple approached slowly and bent down as if examining plants, and noticed something else. In the air around Mrs. Weatherly's body, there lingered an extraordinarily strong odor. It wasn't simply perfume, although perfume was clearly present. It was something sharper, more penetrating, something that reminded Miss Marple of chemical laboratories and the dangerous experiments her experimentalist cousin had conducted years before. It was then that he understood, with the quiet certainty that had characterized his perceptions throughout a lifetime of astute observation, that Mrs. Constance Weatherly had not died of a heart attack. She had been murdered. Detective Inspector James Craddock of the West Sussex County Police Force was a burly, 58-year-old man with the kind of face that suggested a lifetime of judicial decisions and hearty meals. He had arrived at Thornfield Manor within 30 minutes of Mrs. Weatherly's collapse, accompanied by his younger colleague, Sergeant William Mills, who looked like someone whose police career was still in its promising prime. What Inspector Craddock found was a scene of complete social confusion. Friends and acquaintances of the deceased were lining up in the manor's living room, where they had been directed by police orders, while Dr. Whitmore and his assistant, a nurse named Miss Davies, carried out the first examinations of the body in the garden. It was Dr. Whitmore who reported the preliminary facts to the inspector. Mrs. Weatherly had suddenly collapsed in the garden during her own meeting. She had been apparently fine minutes before, and now she was definitely, catastrophically dead. The exact cause would require an autopsy, of course, but the doctor suggested the possibility of a sudden heart attack or possibly a stroke. However, Miss Marple, who was standing discreetly in the corner of the living room near the window overlooking the garden, listened to this with a sense of unease. Dr. Whitmore was a man careful with his words, and she noticed that his eyes had momentarily dropped to the small blue glass vial, now resting on an evidence tray, neatly labelled for examination. "Someone must have done something," was saying Jeremy Weatherly, the hostess's cousin, his voice having that hysterical quality that comes with genuine shock. He was a handsome man of 35, though his appearance at this moment was considerably marred by panic. His fiancée, Miss Violet Ashford, was standing beside him, though notably not supporting him. "No one just collapses for no reason. She was perfectly fine. I saw her only a short time ago. How long ago did you see her exactly?" asked Inspector Craddock, his notepad already open, his pencil waiting patiently. Jeremy seemed puzzled by the question, as if the mathematics of death weren't really his forte. "I'm not exactly sure. Maybe 10 minutes, perhaps more. Time went by so quickly." Miss Marple noticed that Violet Ashford was looking at Jeremy with an expression that might have been pity if it had not been tinged with something harsher, something that suggested an evaluation of what she was seeing, and a determination that she did not particularly like what she saw. In another corner of the room, Mrs. Edith Carmichael, the deceased's sister, sat in a stiff-backed armchair, her face a mask of composure that she seemed to be struggling to maintain. Her daughter Victoria stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, and although her features remained relatively serene, Miss Marple noticed that her fingers were pressing with a force that suggested considerable anxiety. "It's a tragedy," Martin Raleigh, the bank manager, was saying to no one in particular. He was a distinguished man of 42, with the kind of confidence that comes from successfully managing other people's money. "It really is a tragedy. Mrs. Weatherly was a woman of great character." There was a moment of silence after this remark, during which Miss Marple noticed that the bank manager realized that most people in the room did not necessarily seem to agree with his assessment of the deceased. If anything, Mrs. Weatherly's death seemed to have unleashed a range of mildly negative facial expressions that social decency had previously kept in check. "Was it some kind of seizure?" Mrs. Pemberton asked a close friend. "Did you notice how his face turned grey? I've never seen anything like it." And then he just collapsed, like a felled tree. My late husband, God bless him, died in a somewhat similar way, though he had the decency to do it at home, where at least he didn't disturb others. "What I wonder," another guest was saying, a lady named Mrs. Helena Hartwell, whose husband was the chief solicitor in the town, "is whether her heart had been weak. I know her maid, Miss Sutton, quite well through church, and she mentioned that Mrs. Weatherly had been having headaches regularly. Headaches are sometimes signs of heart trouble, aren't they?" It was the kind of homespun medical logic Miss Marple had heard endlessly over the years, based on the firm belief that any symptom could mean practically anything if viewed from the right perspective. Although, in this case, she noted with interest, Mrs. Hartwell seemed to have done considerable preliminary research into the deceased's health circumstances. Dr. Whitmore was briefly summoned into the living room by the inspector, at which point he confirmed the preliminary information. The death had been sudden. The symptoms suggested a severe toxic reaction of some kind, although he could not specify without further analysis. And yes, there was a small bottle of perfume found near the body that would certainly be investigated. "Perfume?" the inspector asked, frowning. "Have you reached any conclusions about what was in the bottle?" "The smell is distinctive," Dr. Whitmore replied. "It's not ordinary perfume. It contains something else, possibly a chemical compound of some kind. I've seen similar cases before, in men who worked in chemical plants. Severe allergic reactions, though usually not fatal. But with the right dose, the right substance," he shrugged, which was a completely inadequate answer to the question. Miss Marple, listening from her strategic position by the window, carefully processed this information. A bottle of perfume, but not ordinary perfume. A chemical substance of some kind, an allergic reaction or poisoning, access to a rare or uncommon drug, and a death that had occurred at a public gathering, witnessed by many people. That's when he realized something else. He stealthily approached where Inspector Craddock was taking down witness statements and asked as innocently as possible, "Is it true, Inspector, that Mrs. Weatherly was seen using a bottle of perfume shortly before her collapse. The inspector looked at her with the kind of skepticism that young men in positions of authority often direct toward elderly women who ask questions. "Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" "Oh, simply because many of us were quite close to her at various times during the afternoon," Miss Marple replied, her voice as harmless as the sound of falling leaves. "And I was thinking that if she had been using the perfume on herself, then perhaps she applied it herself. Although, of course, someone could have given it to her and suggested she use it. These things happen, don't they? In society. Someone offers a little gesture of friendship, and one accepts." The inspector seemed to consider this for a moment, then asked, "Did you see Mrs. Weatherly applying perfume?" "No, Inspector, I didn't," Miss Marple replied honestly. "But someone else might have. I was simply wondering if, the matter predating his death, it might be relevant." Inspector Craddock made a note, though his expression suggested he thought the old woman was simply weaving theories based on very little evidence. That the perfume might have caused her death had been suggested by Dr. Whitmore. But somehow, in the inspector's mind, this had been reclassified as an unfortunate accident rather than a criminal matter. People had allergic reactions. People used products they didn't know would harm them. It was a terrible accident, nothing more. However, Miss Marple knew better than most people that terrible accidents were often exactly what they seemed, carefully disguised murders. As the afternoon wore on, and the police conducted preliminary interviews with everyone present, an interesting pattern of information emerged. It was during these interviews that Miss Marple, sitting quietly knitting what appeared to be a pale yellow handkerchief, though in fact she was merely occupying her hands while her mind worked, overheard several revealing details. When asked about his relationship with his cousin, Jeremy Weatherly admitted to having had several disagreements with her recently. "Nothing major," he said quickly, "just the ordinary tensions that arise when two people from related families sometimes have differences of opinion about certain business investments." Violet Ashford, when interviewed separately from Jeremy, revealed that Mrs. Weatherly had made disapproving remarks about her engagement to Jeremy, suggesting he might do better in the marriage department. When the inspector asked what she meant, Violet blushed deeply and said it seemed to be a matter of kinship and social connections. Mrs. Edith Carmichael was interviewed in a separate room, out of her daughter's earshot. When asked about her relationship with her sister, her answer was a jumble of contradictions. Yes, they had once been close, but in recent years they had had some disagreements. About what? Mrs. Carmichael was reluctant to say. It was a private family matter, she said. Nothing that could possibly have any bearing on what had happened. Martin Raleigh was interviewed briefly. No, he didn't know Mrs. Weatherly particularly well. They did banking, of course. Was there a problem with those transactions? No, absolutely not. Her financial affairs were all perfectly in order. Although, curiously, Miss Marple noticed that when asked if he had seen anyone approach Mrs. Weatherly with the perfume bottle, Martin Raleigh had taken too long to reply, and had glanced briefly towards Violet Ashford. It was around 6 in the evening when the guests were finally allowed to leave. Mrs. Weatherly's body had been taken away by the coroners, and Inspector Craddock had announced that the death would be temporarily classified as circumstances unknown until the autopsy was completed. However, he was generous in his suggestions that it was probably a regrettable accident, an allergic reaction to some beauty product containing an unknown chemical compound. as Miss Marple was escorted out of the manor by her friend Mrs. Pemberton, who had spent most of the afternoon sitting in the waiting room with a wet handkerchief pressed against her forehead. She turned one last time to look at the house. And it was at that precise moment that she saw Mrs. Weatherly's maid, a woman named Miss Agnes Sutton, a servant in her 40s with the kind of face that suggested a life of quiet service, peering out of a side window. Her expression was that of someone whose mind was grappling with deeply disturbing information. Miss Marple mentally added Miss Sutton's name to her list of people whose subsequent conduct would merit careful observation. The next 3 days passed in that peculiar state of limbo that often follows an unexpected death in a small community. Mrs. Weatherly's body was examined by forensic pathologists, and although the preliminary results took some time, it soon became clear to anyone with contacts with the local police that the cause of death was not simply an accident. It was Inspector Craddock who personally visited Miss Marple at her small cottage in St. Mary Mead on Thursday morning. Miss Marple was in her garden, planting petunias in a terracotta pot when he arrived. She removed her gloves with deliberate slowness and invited him in for tea. "I've reached a point in the investigation where I need local perspectives," the inspector said, gratefully accepting a cup of delicately fragrant tea. "You know these people. You understand how things work in a community like this. And if I'm being perfectly honest, you have a rather remarkable track record of, well, noticing things." Miss Marple smiled slightly. Her reputation as a problem solver had been both a blessing and a curse over the years. "Were the autopsy results conclusive, Inspector?" "In a way," Craddock replied, flipping through his notes. "The substance in the perfume bottle has been identified as a chemical compound called trichlorophenol. It's a very effective poison, used primarily in industrial pesticides and laboratory chemicals. It's highly toxic when inhaled in high concentrations, and the dose apparently inhaled by Mrs. Weatherly was absolutely sufficient to cause the kind of collapse we all witnessed." "And how did it get into the perfume bottle, Inspector?" asked Miss Marple, offering a tray of biscuits she had baked that morning. "That's the key question, isn't it?" the inspector replied. "The bottle was subsequently analyzed. It's a genuine perfume bottle, the kind sold at Miss Reynolds's toiletries shop in town. Several have been sold in recent months. The contents of the bottle, as far as we can determine, were switched at some point. The genuine perfume was replaced with this chemical compound." Miss Marple considered this as she slowly sipped her tea. "So we know who the flask originally belonged to?" "That's the problem," the inspector said, his expression darkening. "The bottle is a generic type, and Miss Reynolds has sales records, but they're mostly cash transactions. There have been at least 12 of these bottles sold in the last 6 months to people in the area. It could have been anyone's." "Or," Miss Marple suggested gently, "it could have been bought specifically by someone who wanted it to look as if it had belonged to someone else." The inspector looked at her with newfound respect. "Exactly. Someone who knew how to make this poison, or at least gained access to it. Someone with enough chemical knowledge to make the substitution. And someone who knew Mrs. Weatherly would be using the bottle. Have you confirmed that it was Mrs. Weatherly who applied the perfume?" asked Miss Marple. "There are witnesses who say they saw her using a blue bottle in the hours leading up to the event," the inspector replied, "including her maid, Miss Sutton, who said Mrs. Weatherly asked her to fetch her perfume bottle shortly before the incident." Miss Marple made a mental note. This was crucial information. Mrs. Weatherly hadn't simply found a bottle of perfume at random. Someone had specifically supplied it to her. Someone close to her. My investigators have begun asking questions about exactly where everyone was during the 15 minutes before the deaths, the inspector continued. And this is where things get interesting. Several of the guests appear to have been less than entirely honest about their movements. For example, asked Miss Marple. Jeremy Weatherly claimed to have been on the south side of the garden, looking at the rose bushes, said the inspector, consulting his notes. But his fiancée, Miss Ashford, says she saw him walking toward the house about 5 minutes before he collapsed. When questioned about this, he changed his story and said he had needed to use the bathroom. And is that unusual? Asked Miss Marple. It's not unusual for her to need the bathroom, the inspector replied. What is unusual is that she had approximately 3 previous opportunities to use the bathroom during the afternoon, and apparently didn't. But just before the death occurred, she suddenly needed to use it urgently. Miss Marple processed this. And Miss Ashford? She says she was talking to the bank manager, Martin Raleigh, on the north side of the garden. Raleigh confirms this, although he admits their conversation was somewhat personal. It seems Miss Ashford went to find him because she was worried about something. He refused to say what. I understand, said Miss Marple. And Mrs. Carmichael, the deceased's sister. The inspector sighed. She claims she was inside the house, resting in the music room. Her daughter corroborates this statement. But here's the interesting part. Miss Sutton, the maid, says she saw her in the passage leading to Mrs. Weatherly's bedroom approximately 30 minutes before her death. When questioned about this, Mrs. Carmichael went pale and said that yes, she had briefly gone to touch up her makeup in her sister's room, but that this had no connection to anything. Did you have an opportunity to access Mrs. Weatherly's bedroom, where presumably her toiletries were kept? Asked Miss Marple. Yes, the inspector confirmed. Although it could also have been any one of a number of people, the bedroom door wasn't locked. Any of the guests could have entered if they had wanted to. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers pressed together in the manner the inspector had come to recognize as indicative of deep thought. Inspector, may I ask you something about the backgrounds of these individuals? In particular, do you know anything about the financial affairs of the Weatherly family? The inspector frowned. Why are you asking? Because in my experience, money is the most powerful motivator behind most serious crimes, Miss Marple replied. I've seen people commit almost unthinkable acts for what they believed to be a financial improvement. And several of the people whose behavior seems dubious are all connected to the deceased in ways that might suggest financial complications. The inspector had his detectives investigate, and it turned out Miss Marple had been right. Mrs. Constance Weatherly's financial background was complex. She had inherited the house and a substantial sum of money from her husband, but over the past 5 years or so, she had made a series of unfortunate investments. According to the family solicitor, her funds had dwindled significantly. In fact, she was in the process of considering selling Thornfield Manor, an action that would have dealt a considerable blow to her social standing. Even more interesting was the fact that Mrs. Weatherly's will, which was hastily examined after her death, revealed that she had bequeathed substantial sums of money to her sister, Mrs. Carmichael, as well as to her cousin Jeremy. The total amount of the inheritance came to approximately £30,000, which was a considerable sum, of course. However, most of the money was conditional upon the heirs demonstrating that they were of good moral character. An interesting clause, Miss Marple remarked, when the inspector informed her of this. And it wasn't recently amended, was it? "It was written approximately 10 years ago," the inspector replied, "before his fortunes began to decline. Then each of his potential heirs would be aware that the money existed, but not necessarily aware that its value had eroded," Miss Marple mused. "And of course, they would all be highly motivated to ensure that his death, if it occurred, appeared to be an accident." The inspector rose to leave, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right, Miss Marple. I have work to do. But before I go, is there anything specific you would like me to find out? Any questions you would like me to ask?" Miss Marple pondered for a moment. "Yes, indeed, Inspector. I would particularly wonder about exactly where Dr. Whitmore was at the time of the collapse. He arrived very quickly to help, didn't he? Almost as if he had been waiting for something to happen." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Do you suspect Dr. Whitmore?" "I suspect everyone until I have no reason to," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But Dr. Whitmore is a man who, if he had access to industrial poisons, would surely use them. And yet his behavior at the scene was that of someone acting, not reacting. I would simply wonder why." For Detective Inspector Craddock, it was during a Friday interview with Jeremy Weatherly that the case seemed to take a clear turn. Jeremy, who in their previous interactions had appeared primarily concerned about the unexpected death of his cousin, was now confronted with evidence that his financial circumstances were far more desperate than he had initially admitted. The inspector's junior detective, a man named Sergeant Mills, had traced Jeremy's bank records and discovered he'd been in debt for several months. Not just in debt, but catastrophically in debt. Apparently, Jeremy had made some rather poor investments in the stock market, probably under the influence of bad advice. He was now roughly £1,000 overdrawn, a sum that, for a provincial solicitor, was absolutely disastrous. Worse still, one of his creditors was apparently a disreputable individual named Maurice Black, who was known for collecting debts in a manner that often required legal intervention. In fact, there had been at least one vehement threat directed at Jeremy just a week before Mrs. Weatherly's death. "So," said Detective Inspector Craddock, sitting opposite Jeremy at the local police station, "we have a young man who is financially desperate. We have that same young man who is about to inherit a substantial sum of money. And we have that same young man who, by his own revised admission, was in the house approximately 5 minutes before his cousin died mysteriously." Jeremy turned pale. "This is crazy. I didn't kill my cousin. I feel like her death was an accident. Someone left that bottle of poison in the garden, and she used it without knowing what was in it." "And how exactly did that bottle become available to her?" the inspector asked. "According to the maid, her cousin asked her to bring her perfume. That suggests the bottle was already in a location where the maid could find it, unless the maid was lying." Jeremy shook his head, looking genuinely distressed. "Miss Sutton wouldn't have lied. She's an honest woman. She's worked for my cousin for years." "Then the jar must have been in Mrs. Weatherly's bedroom," the inspector continued, completely impassive. "Who had access to that bedroom, Mr. Weatherly?" "Any of us," Jeremy replied weakly. "The door wasn't locked." "Including you?" "Yes, but I don't." "And you had a motive," the inspector interrupted. "Money, lots of money. Money that would solve your current financial problems. Money that, if you didn't receive it, could possibly result in something worse than simple bankruptcy." It was at this point that Jeremy asked for a lawyer, which was sensible, even though he appeared guilty. The news that Jeremy Weatherly had indeed been arrested as the prime suspect in his cousin's death spread through St. Mary Mead and the surrounding village of Thornfield like wildfire. Suddenly, the case went from a local tragedy to a sensational drama. The local newspapers ran large headlines. Local lawyer accused in death of millionaire relative. The village gossips rejoiced at the implications drawn from such evidence. It was in this context of public speculation that Miss Marple received a visit from her close cousin, Miss Victoria Martin, Mrs. Weatherly's niece. Victoria arrived at Miss Marple's house around 3 in the afternoon, visibly disturbed. Her eyes surrounded by dark circles that suggested sleepless nights. Miss Marple showed her into the drawing room and ordered tea. "I can't believe they arrested Jeremy," Victoria said, as soon as they were far enough out of the maid's earshot. "I know he's having money problems. I know he's in a desperate situation, but he would never have killed anyone. He just couldn't do it. He's Jeremy. He's not a bad person." Miss Marple studied the young woman carefully. "What makes you so sure of her innocence, my dear?" Victoria hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Miss Marple saw that look of fear again, that feeling of being trapped in a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. "Because," Victoria finally said, "I know who did it, or at least I think I do, but I can't tell the police because revealing it would put me in danger." "Victoria," Miss Marple said gently, "let's agree that we have to be completely honest with each other. How can telling the truth to the police possibly put you in any danger?" Victoria pressed her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Because the person I think killed my aunt has access to things. Dangerous things. Things that could be used against me." Miss Marple waited, knowing that silence was often more effective than direct pressure. "It's Dr. Whitmore," Victoria finally said. "I believe it was Dr. Whitmore who killed my aunt. He had access to industrial poisons as a result of his work. He had good reason to think so, because my aunt dismissed him from what must have been a side job shortly after her husband died. I learned this from Miss Sutton, who casually mentioned that Dr. Whitmore used to be a sort of consulting chemist for the house, helping with things like pest control. When my aunt closed up the property and decided not to renew his contract, he became very bitter about it." "And why do you think Victoria would have taken a poison that killed her?" asked Miss Marple. Victoria frowned. "That's the tricky part. I'm not entirely sure. But Dr. Whitmore is a man with a very volatile temper, especially when he's been drinking. And he was drinking quite a bit at the party. I saw several empty whiskey glasses near where he was standing in the garden." Miss Marple noted this. Dr. Whitmore drinking, being a man with a troubled temper, possibly harbouring a vendetta against the deceased. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" asked Miss Marple. Victoria took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Several months ago, my aunt casually mentioned that she'd been looking into Dr. Whitmore's medical practices. Apparently, she'd heard rumours about him performing procedures in a way that, well, wasn't entirely ethical, prescribing medications he didn't need, performing procedures that weren't necessary. She said she was thinking of reporting him to the British Medical Association." "And did he mention this to Dr. Whitmore?" asked Miss Marple. "I don't know," Victoria replied. "But if he did, then he'd have a very powerful reason to want her dead. His career would be ruined." After Victoria left, promising to keep quiet about the conversation, Miss Marple sat in her study and reflected on all she had learned. The pattern was beginning to take shape in his mind, though differently than Detective Inspector Craddock seemed to be seeing the case. Yes, Jeremy Weatherly had a financial motive. But a financial motive was the least interesting of all of the possible motives, because it was the most obvious, the easiest to see. Exactly the kind of motive someone would want the police to see if they were trying to frame someone else. Dr. Whitmore, on the other hand, had a more personal, more dangerous motive: self-preservation. If his career was threatened, if his reputation was at risk, then he would clearly be capable of desperate acts. But one piece still didn't fit. How exactly did the poison vial come into Mrs. Weatherly's possession? Who specifically put it in her hand? It was a seemingly minor observation, the sort of thing that would probably go unnoticed by anyone who didn't have a lifetime of practice in looking for the little inconsistencies in human behavior that finally led Miss Marple in the right direction. The clue was a small detail she noticed while in the village tea room on Saturday morning. Miss Marple had gone there not specifically for tea, but to observe the social composure of certain key characters in the unfolding drama. Miss Agnes Sutton, the late lady's maid, was having her late breakfast at the back of the tea room, as maids did at a separate table, although modern standards were becoming more relaxed regarding such segregation. Miss Marple noticed that Miss Sutton seemed nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting something unpleasant. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the moment Martin Raleigh, the bank manager, entered the tea room. His presence was enough to make Miss Sutton practically jump in her chair, spilling some tea onto her saucer. The bank manager seemed equally surprised to see her there, though his surprise was the kind of someone trying to calculate something. For a few moments, the two simply stared at each other across the tea room. Then, quite deliberately, the bank manager walked over to their table. "Miss Sutton," he said, his voice low, "I think I should have a little private conversation." The maid turned completely pale. "Mr. Raleigh, I don't think it's appropriate that—" "I think that's very appropriate," said Martin Raleigh, sitting down in the chair opposite her anyway. "And I think it would also be appropriate for you to think long and hard before speaking to anyone about certain matters." What followed was a conversation that Miss Marple, conveniently seated at a nearby table with a cup of tea and a piece of cake, could easily hear if she paid close enough attention, which of course she was doing. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," said Miss Sutton. "I think she does know," Raleigh replied. "The question is whether she's going to be sensible about it." Here, the bank manager made the seemingly innocent gesture of placing his hand in his jacket pocket. The gesture was completely undramatic, entirely casual. But it was enough to make Miss Sutton turn even paler, if that were possible. "If you're suggesting," Miss Sutton began. "I'm not suggesting anything," Martin Raleigh interrupted. "I'm simply having a private conversation with a former maid. Private conversations happen all the time, especially conversations that imply it's best for everyone if certain matters remain private." Miss Marple took note of all these details, her mind already moving pieces of the puzzle, organizing what she had seen and heard into a pattern that was finally beginning to make sense. After Raleigh left, leaving Miss Sutton visibly trembling, Miss Marple approached the maid under the pretext of ordering more tea. She sat down in the chair Raleigh had just vacated. "Dear Miss Sutton," he said gently, "you seem to be under considerable stress. I was wondering if I could be of any help." Miss Sutton looked up, and Miss Marple saw in them a mixture of despair and relief. Clearly, the woman was struggling under the weight of some important secret. "I can't talk about this," Miss Sutton said. "I simply can't. I've been threatened." "By whom?" asked Miss Marple. "By the bank manager." The maid nodded miserably. He says that if I say anything about what I saw, Something will happen to my sister. My sister works as a maid in the headmaster's house. He has power over her, work, references, everything." Miss Marple considered this. "And what exactly did you see, Miss Sutton?" "Something to indicate that the bank manager was involved in Mrs. Weatherly's death?" After considerable persuasion, and after Miss Marple made a number of promises that she intended to keep completely, the story emerged. Miss Sutton had been sent to fetch her employer's perfume bottle approximately 30 minutes before her collapse. Mrs. Weatherly had specified that she wanted a particular blue bottle, one that Miss Sutton had placed on her employer's bedroom desk that morning. When the maid entered the bedroom to retrieve the bottle, she found it exactly where she had left it. She delivered it to Mrs. Weatherly in the garden, on the north side, where the hostess was viewing the flowers with a group of friends. But here's the crucial point. As Miss Sutton walked through the corridor toward the bedroom, she saw the bank manager, Martin Raleigh, leaving the room. There was no reason for him to be there. It wasn't an area of the house guests were generally allowed to access. When she questioned him, he simply smiled at her in a completely unwelcome way and told her he was looking for a telephone because he needed to make an urgent business call. Then he walked past her without waiting for a reply. Miss Sutton hadn't given the matter much thought at the time, but after Mrs. Weatherly collapsed and died, she slowly realized exactly what must have happened. The bank manager must have replaced the bottle of genuine perfume with one containing poison. She was the only other person in the house at the time who knew where the bottle was. If she had said anything, she would have been suspected of complicity, or at best, of negligence in her domestic duties. "But why?" asked Miss Marple. "What motive would Martin Raleigh have for killing Mrs. Weatherly?" Miss Sutton hesitated, then said slowly, I think it may have something to do with someone else. Someone Mrs. Weatherly was threatening. Someone he would protect at any cost." "Who?" asked Miss Marple. "Miss Violet," Miss Sutton whispered. "Mr. Jeremy's fiancée. He's in love with her, though she doesn't realize it. Or perhaps she does realize it and simply doesn't care." Mrs. Weatherly was saying dreadful things about Miss Violet, things that were threatening to ruin the engagement to Mr. Jeremy. If the engagement were to end, then Miss Violet would be free to be with someone else, wouldn't she? Miss Marple sat up abruptly, the whole picture of the crime rearranging itself in her mind. This was a crime of passion disguised as a crime of money. Dr. Whitmore might have had a motive, but it was Martin Raleigh who had the opportunity, and, more importantly, the real motive, protecting someone he loved. Miss Sutton's information was enough to convince Miss Marple that she should contact Inspector Craddock directly. She did so by telephone, in terms vague enough not to alarm anyone who might be listening, simply suggesting that she had some information that might be relevant to the investigation, and that they would be coming to her house at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Inspector Craddock, who by then was increasingly realizing that his case against Jeremy Weatherly wasn't as solid as he had initially believed. After all, the boy could simply be a scapegoat, arrived fairly quickly. It was during this conversation that the entire structure of the crime was finally revealed. Martin Raleigh had apparently been in love with Violet Ashford for about a year. It wasn't a love she knew about or reciprocated, but something she carried silently, something that gave meaning to her ordinary life as a bank manager. He knew she was engaged to Jeremy Weatherly, but he believed, not without some justification, that she wasn't entirely happy about the engagement. Then Mrs. Constance Weatherly, who clearly had nothing more constructive to do with her time, had begun to murmur about serious concerns regarding Miss Ashford's character. The specific insinuations varied, but they implied that Violet was perhaps too flirtatious, too willing to seek the attention of men other than her fiancé, and therefore would not make a suitable wife for any respectable gentleman. If these hints spread widely enough, they could effectively ruin Violet's marriage prospects. Jeremy Weatherly, while perhaps not the most decisive man, would definitely end the engagement if his reputation were at risk. And Martin Raleigh, patiently waiting in the wings, might well have a chance. But Mrs. Weatherly didn't seem inclined to let the matter drop. In fact, in the days leading up to the garden party, she had informed Violet directly that she didn't think Violet a suitable match for Jeremy, and that she was seriously considering speaking to the family about it. Furthermore, she had hinted that if Violet had any sense, she would gladly accept the end of the engagement, or else face a smear campaign that would follow her everywhere. When Miss Ashford reported all this to Martin Raleigh, apparently she had turned to him as a confidant. The bank manager apparently reached a fatal conclusion. Mrs. Weatherly was an obstacle to the happiness of both Violet and himself. She had to be removed. The death was supposed to look like an accident, an allergic reaction to a cosmetic, a regrettable tragedy. The poison he used, trichlorophenol, which he had obtained from his cousin, a man who worked at an industrial chemical plant, was replaced in the perfume bottle during a moment of opportunity when he happened to be wandering around the house unnoticed. He informed Miss Sutton by seeing that it was the maid who had later retrieved the bottle, but he trusted that the maid wouldn't understand the implications of what she had seen, and that even if she did, she would be afraid to speak. It was a very well-planned crime, Miss Marple told the inspector, but it contains within it the seed of its own revelation, as crimes of passion often do, for it acts upon a motive which its perpetrators cannot articulate without exposing themselves. Mr. Raleigh could not simply eliminate Mrs. Weatherly because she stood in his way. He had to do it in a way that would protect someone he loved. And that protection, by its very nature, bound him to his victims in a way that a crime committed purely for money would not require. "But how did you know that Miss Ashford wasn't also engaged?" the inspector asked. "That she simply wouldn't reject your advances?" "I didn't know that," Miss Marple replied calmly, "but that's how men in love behave. They commit irrational acts in the hope of results that may never materialize. It's pathetic, really, the way men and women can ruin their lives and the lives of others for what they believe to be love." But this is where the case took an unexpected turn, a turn that almost no one would have predicted. When the police went to arrest Martin Raleigh, they went directly to his home in the city. They found him in his study, with a fully written confession letter on his desk. Apparently, he had decided it was better to confess than to face a lengthy trial that would inevitably make him look like a fool or a lunatic or both. What was completely unexpected was that when the detectives returned to the police station after processing Raleigh, they found Dr. Whitmore waiting for them in the hallway. The doctor demanded to speak with Inspector Craddock immediately, and when he was taken into the interrogation room, he proceeded to make a confession of his own, albeit of a completely different kind. It turned out that Dr. Whitmore knew exactly who had put the poison in Mrs. Weatherly's bottle. He had seen Martin Raleigh leaving the bedroom just after the maid was sent to retrieve the bottle. As a man with considerable chemical knowledge, he had been able to deduce fairly quickly what had happened. Now, Dr. Whitmore wasn't a man without his own reasons for wanting Mrs. Weatherly dead, but he was a man who valued his own freedom more than his feelings of revenge. The threat of being framed for murder, because if no one confessed, there was certainly a good chance that all the close suspects would be charged, was enough to make him change his mind about the code of silence. Furthermore, Dr. Whitmore apparently had his own reason for sympathizing with Martin Rowley, at least in one respect. It turned out that the doctor had been quietly helping Violet Ashford with certain personal health issues, the kind of matters a young woman might not wish to discuss with her future mother-in-law, and which Mrs. Weatherly had discovered, only adding to her belief that Violet was morally dubious. Dr. Whitmore, who apparently had a streak of professional honor despite his other flaws, was unwilling to allow a man to be convicted of murder when he was simply trying to protect someone he loved from the intrusion of a disapproving-minded woman. With Martin Rowley's confession secured, one might almost have thought the case closed. But Inspector Craddock, increasingly aware that the solution to the case owed much to Miss Marple's intervention, felt it appropriate to allow her to have a satisfactory conclusion. It was for this reason that he invited all of the main suspects and witnesses to meet in the living room of Thornfield Manor one afternoon, approximately a week after Martin Rowley's arrest. The house now belonged to Jeremy Weatherly by virtue of his cousin's will, albeit under rather unusual circumstances. Jeremy was here, evidently relieved to have been exonerated. Violet Ashford was at his side, though her demeanor suggested a certain unease with the overall situation. Victoria Martin was present, as was her mother, Mrs. Carmichael. Dr. Whitmore was here, displaying his usual disapproval of everything. Miss Sutton was here, seemingly flustered at having been the cause of the crime's exposure. And of course, Miss Marple was here, sitting in a chair by the window, her knitting needle still moving in a way that indicated deep concentration. Inspector Craddock opened the proceedings in a rather formal manner. I have gathered you all here today to fully establish the facts of the case, and to express the official gratitude of the police to certain individuals whose assistance has been invaluable in solving this crime, he began, uncomfortable with the social protocol of the situation. He continued, What happened in the garden of Thornfield Manor a week ago was deliberate murder, not an accident as it was made to appear. Mrs. Stewart Constance Weatherly was murdered using a poisonous chemical compound that was placed in her own perfume bottle by Martin Rowley, the manager of the local bank. A murmur rippled through the room. Violet Ashford turned very pale. The inspector then outlined the facts of the case, including Rowley's motive, his method, and how his actions had endangered an innocent man, Jeremy, from being accused of the crime. However, continued the inspector, addressing Miss Marple, none of this would have been revealed without the keen observation and logical reasoning of one person present that day. Miss Jane Marple, a resident of St. Mary Mead, was able to see what others could not. That the crime was motivated not by money, but by love, and that the real key to solving the case lay in understanding human nature rather than in forensic evidence. There was applause, though it was rather awkward. Miss Marple simply continued knitting. It was only then that something more unexpected happened. Violet Ashford stood up suddenly, her face contorted with emotion. I can't stay silent, she said. All the lies, all the half-truths, I must tell the truth now. My dear, the inspector began, the case is solved. There's no need to... There's every need, Violet interrupted, because I knew Martin had done this. I knew it. and I didn't say anything for a week while I let everyone believe Jeremy might be guilty. An absolute silence fell over the room. I knew Martin wanted Mrs. Weatherly dead, Violet continued, her words coming out in a burst of confession. He told me so, not entirely directly. He suggested that if she were out of the way, everything would be better. I didn't think he was serious. I thought he was just frustrated, speaking hypothetically. But then she died, and I knew, in a way that I just knew, that he had done it. And I didn't say anything because part of me wanted her dead. She was so cruel, so unfair, so meddlesome. Violet, Jeremy said, standing up. What are you saying? I am saying that I am a horrible person, Violet replied, with a tone of self-pity that Miss Marple found revealing. That I allowed a man to commit murder, partly on my behalf. That I mentally forgave him for what he had done, because the victim was someone I detested. Miss Marple dropped her knitting needles. My dear, she said, her voice firm, you need to understand something important. It would have been better if you had stood up a week ago and told the truth, much better. But it's important that you speak now, because there's a deeper reason why you didn't initially. What reason? Violet asked, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. Because Miss Marple replied, you're someone who's used to letting others make decisions for you, whether it's your fiancé or the bank manager or Mrs. Weatherly. They all seem to have opinions about who you were and what you should do. And never, in all these years, did anyone seem to ask you who you really were, what you wanted, what you dreamed of. Violet collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. Jeremy, after a moment of bewilderment, sat down beside her. He didn't touch her, but sat close enough to offer support. Miss Marple then turned to Mrs. Carmichael. As for you, my dear, she said, you should know that your sister was in the process of changing her will. She was about to reduce your allowance because she had learned of your own financial indiscretions. The loans you had made to relatives who probably had no intention of repaying you. She intended to protect her legacy money from mismanagement. It wasn't an act of cruelty, even though you saw it that way. Mrs. Carmichael seemed to crumble under this revelation, as if a mistake she had made years before was finally being revealed. And finally, he addressed Dr. Whitmore. You think you're a noble man, said Miss Marple, because you spoke up and revealed what you knew about Martin Raleigh's murder. But in fact you remained silent for nearly a week, knowing exactly who had committed the murder, all the while allowing an innocent man to be accused. The difference between you and Miss Ashford is simply that one of you eventually found the courage to speak out, and the other was compelled to do so when you realized you were in personal danger. Motive determines action, Dr. Whitmore, and your motives, when you were finally compelled to act, were always your own. Now, said Miss Marple, rising slowly from her chair with the aid of her cane, I will reveal to you exactly what happened and why, although I suspect that Inspector Craddock has come to nearly the same conclusions. He walked slowly around the room, his eyes inspecting each person in turn. The crime committed here was, in its essence, one of the oldest crimes known to humankind. The killing of one person by another who believes they are acting in defense of someone they love. Although, of course, the defense was in every other respect except defensive. It was aggressive, it was preemptive, and it was, in legal terms, pure murder. Martin Raleigh, the director of our local bank, a 42-year-old man who by all accounts had lived a perfectly respectable life, committed an act of violence because he felt that Mrs. Weatherly was threatening the well-being of someone he loved, Miss Violet Ashford. Now Miss Ashford did not know that she was loved in this way. Indeed, she may have had some indication of Mr. Raleigh's feelings, but she had no idea of the intensity of those feelings. But Martin Raleigh believed he knew Miss Ashford better than she knew herself. He believed her engagement to Mr. Jeremy Weatherly was a matter of social convenience rather than genuine affection. And he believed that if Mrs. Constance Weatherly were not in the way, continually interfering and undermining Miss Ashford's reputation, then the young woman would be free to pursue true happiness. The question, of course, is whether any of this was true. Was Miss Ashford's engagement unhappy? Probably. Would there have been any prospect of her transferring her affections to Mr. Raleigh if circumstances had been different? Possibly not. But what is certain is that Martin Raleigh believed it was true, and he acted on that belief. Now, how did he obtain the chemical compound he used? It turns out that his cousin, a man named Bertrand Raleigh, worked at an industrial chemical facility near Manchester. Martin Raleigh wrote to him several months earlier requesting information about trichlorophenol, the chemical compound he ultimately used. He stated that he wanted it for a personal research project. His cousin provided both the information and a small quantity of the compound itself. When exactly did she plan to use the poison? Probably not until recently. It was probably only when she realized that Mrs. Weatherly was about to launch an active campaign to destroy Miss Ashford's reputation that she decided to act. How did he know Mrs. Weatherly would be wearing a bottle of perfume on the day of the garden party? He probably wasn't sure. But it was a risk he was willing to take. If Mrs. Weatherly hadn't worn a bottle of perfume that day, the plan would have failed. But Miss Sutton was sent to retrieve the bottle. The substitution was made, and Mrs. Weatherly, completely unaware of the danger, applied the poisonous compound directly to her face, inhaled a concentrated amount of the toxic gas, and collapsed. And here is where the cunning of the criminal mind turns against itself. Martin Raleigh committed the crime hoping it would look like an accident. But the presence of the vial of poison near the body, though small and insignificant to most people, was noticed by someone whose eyes were trained to notice exactly such inconsistencies. Miss Marple then proceeded to describe exactly how and why she had suspected Martin Raleigh, including observing his interaction with Miss Ashford during the afternoon, the way his eyes constantly followed her, the way he seemed to be watching Mrs. Weatherly's every move, as if waiting for the exact moment when he could act. It was, in a sense, a completely predictable crime, Miss Marple concluded, because it was the crime of someone who couldn't see things clearly. Martin Raleigh saw what he wanted to see. He saw Violet Ashford as unhappy in her engagement when the reality may have been quite different. He saw Mrs. Weatherly as an incomparable hag, when the reality was that she was simply being possessive and meddlesome in the way that many women of her class are. And he saw himself as a saviour hero, when in fact he was simply a man who allowed passion to overcome reason. It's a lesson we all have to learn, Miss Marple continued, addressing Violet Ashford specifically, that acts committed in our name are frequently committed against our own interests. That love, though in theory a beautiful thing, can easily become a justification for violence when the person who loves cannot accept the reality of who we truly are. The months following Martin Raleigh's arrest and subsequent trial were, in many ways, a return to normalcy. Although, of course, the word normalcy was relative in a small community that had been so violently shaken. Martin Raleigh was tried in county court. The defence argued a crime of passion, citing a number of mitigating circumstances. The prosecution argued that the crime had been premeditated, calculated, with the poison planned weeks before the actual event, completely negating the notion that it was merely a momentary outburst of lovesick madness. The jury, after deliberating for 2 days, found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which was considered a reasonably severe sentence, although others believed it should have been longer. Jeremy Weatherly, now the sole owner of Thornfield Manor, spent some time considering what to do with the property. He eventually decided to keep it as a summer residence, although he spent most of the year in London, where he established a more lucrative legal practice. His engagement to Violet Ashford was dissolved, though not immediately. The separation was slow, filled with awkward conversations in tea rooms and walks in public parks. Eventually, after about 6 months, both Violet and Jeremy came to the mutual conclusion that their bond had never been strong enough to withstand the strain the affair had placed on him. Violet remained in the village for a time, working as a governess in the home of a prominent family. Gradually, the rumors and speculation about her role in the events subsided, though they never completely disappeared. Eventually, she married a decent man from a respectable family, a cloth merchant from the nearby town of Eastbourne. It was not a passionate marriage, but it appeared to be one of relative happiness and compatibility. Mrs. Carmichael received her inheritance, though a smaller amount than she had anticipated. She and her daughter Victoria moved to a smaller house on the Sussex coast, where Mrs. Carmichael spent her later years developing an interest in freshwater gardening and cultivating a small but genuinely warm circle of friends. Dr. Whitmore continued to practice medicine in the town, though his patient population gradually dwindled. When he finally retired at the age of 65, he was considered by most to be a man whose best work was definitely behind him. Miss Sutton stayed at Thornfield Manor when it was rented out during the months Jeremy was away. She lived the rest of her life under that roof. A woman scarred by the knowledge of a crime, but who had found within herself the courage to finally speak out. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her small house at St. Mary Mead, where she resumed her relatively quiet life. She received occasional letters from people thanking her for her discretion, though she had never been entirely indiscreet in her methods. She continued her activities at the parish. She continued to visit the village tea room, where the local ladies found her presence reassuring, though also slightly unsettling, as if this old woman had the ability to peer into the secrets of their lives and uncover what they truly concealed there. On a quiet autumn afternoon, several months after the case had been closed, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her cup of tea, watching the leaves change colour. Her friend Mrs. Pemberton was with her naturally. Mrs. Pemberton was always with her on these occasions, a constant like the changing of the seasons. "I was wondering," Mrs. Pemberton said, "if you ever regretted getting involved in all this. All these murders and dark secrets, it seems utterly exhausting." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "No, my dear, I don't regret it for a moment, because, you see, the mistake most people make is to think that mystery must be something extraordinary, something that requires special circumstances or special individuals. But in fact, the most interesting mysteries and the most frightening crimes arise from the ordinary circumstances of ordinary life." "What do you mean?" asked Mrs. Pemberton. "Well," Miss Marple replied, "take the case of Martin Raleigh. Here was a man who, in every respect, seemed completely ordinary, a respectable man, a man with a position in the community, a man whose life would seem to be of interest to nobody. But beneath the surface, he was capable of the most extraordinary acts simply because he allowed himself to mistake his own desires for the reality of the world." "So you think it was passion that drove him to commit the murder?" Mrs. Pemberton asked. "No," Miss Marple replied precisely. "It was self-deception, the ability to believe one's own stories about oneself. The ability to become the hero of one's own narrative drama, regardless of what reality suggested. That is what is truly dangerous about human beings. Not evil, but the ability to see oneself as good even while carrying out evil. "So what have we learned from all this?" asked Mrs. Pemberton. Miss Marple considered this question carefully, while her eyes followed the falling leaves in her garden. "We have learned," he said finally, "that human life is infinitely more complex than it appears on the surface. That beneath the most perfect courtesy, beneath the most radiant smiles, beneath the most carefully maintained uniformity of respectable living, there are impulses that would never leave the surface were it not for circumstances that push them out. We have learned that forgiveness and understanding are important, but not at the expense of justice. We have learned, in short, that human nature is a study that is never truly finished." "And Miss Ashford?" asked Mrs. Pemberton, who seemed to have a particular interest in romances. "Do you think she was happy in the end?" "In her own way," Miss Marple replied. "She learned that life isn't a matter of being saved by handsome knights or men in love. She learned that true happiness comes from knowing who you really are, and having the courage to live in accordance with that knowledge. If she found that in her marriage to the Eastbourne draper, then yes, she was happy in her own way." "And Martin Raleigh?" asked Mrs. Pemberton. "Do you ever think about him?" Miss Marple was completely honest in her reply. "Sometimes, yes. I think of him sitting in his cell, finally having time to reflect on who he really was, without the distractions of everyday life. And I wonder if he ever came to a true understanding of what he did and why. I hope he did, because understanding is the only true redemption he has." "Do you think he will ever be forgiven?" Mrs. Pemberton asked. "By heaven, perhaps," replied Miss Marple, "but that is not really my concern. My concern during the course of this affair was to ensure that the truth was revealed and justice served. The rest is in the hands of authorities higher than myself." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Miss Marple and Mrs. Pemberton sat in silence, each with their own thoughts, and in the quiet of that moment, Miss Marple reflected on how life unfolded in ways that could seldom be anticipated. How death and secrecy so often slept side by side in small English villages, and how careful observation and an understanding of human nature were truly the most powerful tools in solving life's most intriguing mysteries. Life at St. Mary Mead would go on as usual. The women would still gather for tea and gossip about their neighbours' affairs. The men would continue with their public business, oblivious to the depths of intrigue that often lay beneath the surface of their communities. And Miss Marple would still be knitting, watching, waiting, for that is what her life was made of. The quiet observation of the endless patterns of human behaviour, the understanding that beneath every face there is a story, within every story a secret, and within every secret the truth.